peaceful morning, a quiet park, and a moment to relax. But sometimes, trouble finds you when you least expect it. What starts as a simple encounter quickly spirals into a tense showdown, one that no one saw coming. How far can power be abused before justice steps in? Watch till the end to see how this intense story unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. What would you do in this situation? Jason Statham sat on a worn wooden bench in the middle of a quiet park, enjoying the crisp morning air. He had always appreciated these moments of solitude, a break from the constant chaos of Hollywood, training, and high-intensity action. A newspaper rested in his hands, the fresh ink staining his fingertips as he flipped through the pages. The faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and distant chirping of birds created a serene atmosphere, something rare in his usual fast-paced life. He took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over him. His peace was short-lived. Footsteps approached from the side, breaking the tranquility. 2 uniformed police officers, each holding a steaming cup of coffee, strode toward him. Their posture was relaxed, but their eyes held something less than friendly. One was tall and lanky, with sharp cheekbones and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. The other was shorter but stocky, with a shaved head and a gaze that carried an air of authority mixed with irritation. They stopped right in front of Jason, casting shadows over his paper. "You enjoying yourself?" the tall officer asked casually, taking a sip of his coffee. His smirk widened slightly, but there was no warmth behind it. Jason slowly lowered his newspaper and looked up at them, his expression neutral. "Yeah, nice morning. Something I can help you with?" The shorter officer scoffed. "That depends. What are you doing here?" Jason raised an eyebrow. "Sitting. Reading the news. That a problem?" The officers exchanged a glance. The taller one shifted his weight and adjusted his belt, his fingers brushing against the holster at his hip. "Just making sure. You fit a description." Jason tilted his head slightly. "Do I?" The short officer took another sip of his coffee, then sighed dramatically. "We had a report of a suspicious individual in the area. White male, bald, wearing a suit." His eyes drifted over Jason's neatly tailored blazer. "You see the resemblance?" Jason let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "You're telling me you're questioning me because I'm bald and wearing a suit? That's the best you've got?" The taller officer's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to getting pushback. "It's a simple question. You got ID on you?" Jason folded his newspaper and placed it beside him. His calm demeanor didn't change, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Did I break any laws?" The short officer's jaw tightened. "When a police officer asks you for ID, you provide it. That's how this works." Jason leaned back against the bench, his posture relaxed but firm. "Not unless you have reasonable suspicion. Otherwise, I have no obligation to give you anything." The 2 officers exchanged another look, irritation flickering between them. The taller one's smirk was completely gone now. The stocky officer, clearly annoyed, took a step forward. "You think you're funny?" His voice carried a sharper edge now. Jason sighed. He had seen this act before. Cops who thought they could intimidate people into compliance. The problem was, they had picked the wrong person. "Look," Jason said, his tone still controlled. "If you're looking for trouble, you're not gonna find it here. I'm just sitting in a park, reading the news. That's all there is to it." The tall officer took a slow sip of his coffee, then suddenly turned the cup over, letting the steam and liquid spill down onto Jason's blazer. The hot liquid soaked through the fabric, the strong scent of burnt coffee filling the air. Jason's jaw tightened. His hand instinctively curled into a fist, but he forced himself to stay still. "Oops," the officer said, voice dripping with mock innocence. "Guess that was an accident." The short officer smirked and stepped closer. "Here's the thing. We don't like attitudes. You think you can talk back to us like that?" Jason exhaled slowly through his nose, controlling the simmering frustration. He had handled men tougher than these two in far worse situations, but that didn't mean he would tolerate being pushed around. The taller officer suddenly pulled out his baton, spinning it lazily in his hand. "See? Guys like you don't understand how things work around here. You don't question cops. You don't get smart. You just do what you're told." Jason glanced at the baton, then back at the officer's smug expression. "You really want to go down this road?" The short officer grinned. "You bet." Before Jason could respond, the taller officer pulled out his radio and pressed the button. "This is Unit 47. We've got a hostile suspect at the park. White male, bald, resisting orders, requesting backup." Jason's eyes narrowed. "That's not what's happening, and you know it." The officer shrugged. "Doesn't matter what's happening. Matters what people hear on the radio." Jason clenched his jaw. He had tried to be civil. He had given them every opportunity to walk away. But now they had made their choice. The stocky officer reached for his baton as well. "Last chance. You're going to comply, or we're going to make sure you do." Jason let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You had your warning." The tension snapped like a live wire. The tall officer swung his baton, aiming for Jason's ribs. But Jason was faster. He dodged, his reflexes honed from years of training, and caught the officer's wrist, twisting it sharply. The baton clattered to the ground. Before the officer could react, Jason drove his elbow into the man's gut, sending him staggering backward. The short officer's eyes widened, and he lunged forward, swinging wildly. Jason sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and used his momentum against him, flipping him over onto the bench. The officer groaned in pain as his back slammed against the wood. The taller cop, recovering from the blow, reached for his gun. Jason didn't hesitate. A swift kick knocked the weapon from his grasp, sending it skidding across the pavement. Now, both officers were down, gasping for breath. Jason stood over them, fists clenched, his calm demeanor completely gone. The tall officer struggled to reach his radio again, his voice strained. "Suspect, attacking officers, needs to be neutralized." Jason scoffed. "You're unbelievable." Just as the officer started to move again, a powerful voice cut through the air. "Enough!" All three men froze. A heavy-set man in a crisp police uniform strode toward them, flanked by two additional officers. His presence alone demanded respect, and the way his steely eyes scanned the situation made it clear he already knew what had happened. Jason exhaled slowly. Finally, someone who might actually see through this mess. The two beaten officers scrambled to their feet, straightening their uniforms, trying to look professional despite their bruises. "Sir, this man attacked us," the short officer blurted out. "We were just doing our job." The commanding officer's expression didn't change. He turned his gaze to Jason, then back to his men. "I heard everything," he said, his voice cold as steel. The color drained from the two officers' faces. Jason crossed his arms, waiting. The commanding officer's next words were final. "You two are done." The moment hung heavy in the air. Jason Statham stood over the two officers, his fists still clenched, his body tense from the sudden burst of action. His blazer was soaked with coffee, his patience was gone, and yet he remained in control. The commanding officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a face lined with experience, strode forward with authority. His sharp eyes darted between the two disheveled officers and Statham, assessing the situation in seconds. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. The two officers, now fully aware of the mess they had created, scrambled to straighten their uniforms, trying to appear composed. The taller one, his lips split and his pride wounded, took half a step toward the commanding officer. "Sir, we—" "Shut your mouth." The senior officer cut him off, his voice like a blade. His gaze burned into the two men before flicking toward Jason. "I heard everything." Jason remained silent. There was no need to defend himself. This wasn't his fight to argue. He had been minding his own business, and these two had decided to make it a problem. If their superior had witnessed the whole ordeal, then the truth was already clear. The two officers stiffened, their faces pale. "But, sir," the shorter one started, his voice edged with desperation. "Save it," the commanding officer snapped. His patience had already run dry. "I've seen this before. Two hot-headed patrolmen who think they can throw their weight around. You think your badge makes you untouchable?" His glare intensified. "It doesn't." Jason watched as the two officers swallowed hard, their bravado shrinking under the weight of their superior's words. The taller one shifted uncomfortably. "We thought he fit the description of a suspect." "And what description was that?" The commander cut in, his voice razor-sharp. "White, bald, wearing a suit?" He shook his head in disbelief. "You call that reasonable suspicion?" Neither officer responded. Jason exhaled quietly, watching the scene unfold. He had encountered plenty of men like these before, ones who thrived on the power their uniform provided, but crumbled the moment real consequences arrived. The commanding officer took a step closer, his expression darkening. "You two just committed assault. You escalated a situation that never needed to be one. You called in false charges on an innocent man." He nodded toward Jason. "And worst of all, you picked the wrong damn person to pull this on." Jason smirked slightly. That last part was an understatement. The short officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, we didn't mean—" "What you meant doesn't matter." The commanding officer motioned toward the two patrolmen. "Hand over your weapons and badges." Silence. The weight of the demand was suffocating. The two officers hesitated, as if the act of removing their badges meant acknowledging their defeat. "Now!" The command left no room for argument. With reluctant, fumbling movements, the two officers unlatched their holsters and placed their firearms onto the bench beside them. Their badges followed soon after, their polished metal dull under the morning sun. Jason watched, expression unreadable. He wasn't satisfied. Not yet. These two had tried to frame him, and if their boss hadn't arrived, there was no telling how badly this could have ended. The commanding officer crossed his arms. "You're both suspended effective immediately. You'll be facing an internal investigation, and if I find out you've pulled anything like this before, I'll make sure you never wear a badge again." The taller officer's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't argue. He knew it was over. The commander turned his gaze toward Jason, his expression softening slightly. "I want to personally apologize for this incident." Jason shook his head. "I don't need an apology. I need officers who know how to do their job right." The commander nodded in understanding. "Believe me, I know." He turned back to his disgraced officers. "Now, get the hell out of my sight." The two officers hesitated only a moment before collecting their things and walking away, their heads low. Their arrogance was gone. All that remained was humiliation. As they disappeared from view, the commander turned back to Jason. "Are you all right?" Jason glanced down at his coffee-stained blazer and let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Been through worse." The commander studied him for a moment before exhaling. "I wish I could say this never happens. But you and I both know that's not true." Jason nodded. He had seen corruption, abuse of power, and injustice before. This was nothing new. The older man sighed. "Look, I understand if you want to file a formal complaint." Jason thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No point. You handled it. That's enough." The commander gave a slow nod, his respect evident. "For what it's worth, I appreciate you not making things worse." Jason smirked. "Oh, trust me. If I wanted to make things worse, you'd know." The commander let out a dry chuckle before extending a hand. Jason shook it firmly. "Take care, Statham." Jason turned and walked away, his steps steady, his posture unwavering. The morning was still early, but it already felt like an entire day had passed. He rolled his shoulders, exhaling through his nose. Maybe next time he'd drink his coffee at home. Jason Statham walked away from the confrontation, his steps steady but his mind still burning with irritation. The commanding officer had done the right thing, but the taste left in Jason's mouth was still bitter. He had dealt with corrupt cops before, men who abused their authority to feel powerful, but this had been outright reckless. If that officer hadn't shown up, the situation could have turned much worse. He didn't like thinking about how many other people had been victims of these two without someone to step in. The thought made his jaw tighten as he adjusted his blazer, still damp from the coffee that had been dumped on him. He needed to get out of this park and get himself cleaned up. As he turned the corner of the park path, he heard something behind him. Hurried footsteps. His instincts flared immediately, honed from years of training and experience. He didn't turn around right away, instead listening carefully, feeling the rhythm of the movement behind him. It wasn't random. Someone was following him, keeping a measured pace, trying not to make it obvious. Jason clenched his fist but kept walking, waiting for the right moment. Then the footsteps quickened. In an instant, Jason pivoted, shifting his weight to his back foot as he turned toward the approaching figure. His muscles tensed, ready for a fight. But instead of an attacker, he found himself facing one of the officers from earlier, the taller one, the smug one who had dumped coffee on him. Only now there was no smugness in his face. There was something else entirely. Rage. "You think this is over?" The officer's voice was low and venomous, his hands balled into fists. His badge and gun were gone. He had already been stripped of them, but that didn't seem to stop him from looking for trouble. Jason exhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "Walk away." The officer took a step closer. "You humiliated us," he spat. "You humiliated me." Jason tilted his head slightly, studying him. "No, you did that to yourself." The officer's nostrils flared. "You think you can just walk away from this like nothing happened?" Jason's patience was thinning. "That's exactly what I'm doing. But if you keep pushing, you're not going to like where this ends." For a moment, the officer hesitated. Jason could see the conflict in his eyes, the flicker of doubt. The rational part of his brain must have been telling him to let this go, but the ego-driven, power-hungry side of him wouldn't allow it. He lunged. Jason saw it coming a mile away. The former cop swung wildly, aiming for Jason's face with a telegraphed punch that was easy to dodge. Jason sidestepped smoothly, watching as the man's fist cut through empty air. Before the officer could recover, Jason grabbed his wrist, twisted it, and sent him stumbling forward with a sharp push. The officer staggered but didn't go down. Instead, he turned again, snarling as he reached into his jacket. Jason's muscles coiled, ready to strike. If this guy had a weapon, things were about to get ugly. But before the officer could pull anything, a voice rang out from behind. "Don't even think about it." Both men froze. The commanding officer from earlier was back, this time with two uniformed officers at his sides. His face was set in a hard, unforgiving glare as he stalked toward them. The ex-officer's face twisted in frustration. "Sir, Save it," the commander growled. "I gave you a direct order to leave. And now I find you here trying to pick a fight like some street thug?" He shook his head, his disappointment evident. "You just proved exactly why you don't deserve that badge." The ex-officer looked around, his eyes darting between Jason and his former superior. He opened his mouth to protest, but there was nothing he could say to justify what he'd just done. "Get out of here," the commander ordered, "before I have you arrested." For a long moment, the ex-officer stood there, breathing heavily, his face red with barely contained rage. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and stormed away. Jason watched him go, making sure the man didn't try anything else. When he was gone, the commander let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "This guy," he muttered. "I should have fired him months ago." Jason turned to face him fully. "Why didn't you?" The commander's expression hardened. "Internal politics. Reports get buried. Complaints go missing. I tried to push for investigations, but someone always shut them down before they got far enough." He exhaled sharply. "But this? There's no covering this up. His career is done." Jason nodded, but something still didn't sit right with him. If complaints had been ignored before, how many others had suffered because of this guy? The commander must have seen the look on his face, because he gave a small nod of understanding. "I get it. You're wondering how many other people got screwed over by him before now." He paused, then added, "I'll look into it." Jason studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. Then he gave a small nod. "Good." The commander sighed again, his expression weary. This day just keeps getting better. "You need anything before you go?" Jason glanced down at his blazer, still stained with coffee. Then he shook his head. "Nah, I'm done here." The commander gave him one last look, then extended a hand. Jason shook it firmly. "Take care, Statham." Without another word, Jason turned and walked away. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, the residual adrenaline from the fight, but he forced himself to push it aside. He had nothing left to prove. The battle was over. For now. Jason Statham walked away from the confrontation, his footsteps steady as he left the park behind. He had dealt with his share of corrupt authority figures before, but something about this entire situation left a bitter taste in his mouth. The commanding officer had handled it well, but the fact remained, those two officers had nearly gotten away with their abuse of power. If Jason had been someone else, someone without his skills and reputation, the outcome might have been very different. That thought sat heavy in his mind as he made his way down the sidewalk, the city humming around him with early morning energy. He needed a moment to clear his head, to let the frustration drain out of his system. Maybe grab a fresh coffee, preferably one that wasn't dumped on him. Just as he was considering his next move, the wail of sirens cut through the air. Jason instinctively turned his head, his senses sharpening. A police car sped past, followed closely by another. Something was happening. He wasn't the type to stick his nose where it didn't belong, but after the morning he'd had, curiosity got the best of him. He crossed the street, moving toward where the police cars had just gone. As he neared the area, he spotted a small crowd gathering near a convenience store. The store's glass door was wide open, and inside, 2 officers were wrestling a man to the ground. Jason immediately recognized one of them. It was the ex-officer from earlier, the one who had dumped coffee on him. Jason stopped at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossing as he observed. The man on the ground was yelling, struggling against the officers holding him down. From the way they handled him, Jason could tell the force being used was excessive. The ex-officer, no longer in uniform but still acting as if he had authority, pressed his knee against the suspect's back with unnecessary aggression. The other officer, one Jason didn't recognize, looked unsure but followed along, either unwilling or too afraid to intervene. Jason's jaw tightened. He had seen enough. He pushed forward through the small group of onlookers until he was within speaking range. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm. The ex-officer's head snapped up, and his eyes darkened the moment he recognized Jason. "You again?" he spat, his knee pressing down even harder. "This doesn't concern you." Jason took another step forward, his tone unwavering. "You're not a cop anymore. You have no right to be doing this." The officer standing beside him hesitated, clearly thrown off by Jason's presence. "Wait, what?" he asked, looking at his partner. "You're not on duty?" Jason's words had landed a direct hit. The ex-officer scowled, his frustration bubbling over. "This guy's a suspect. He was shoplifting, resisting arrest." Jason's sharp gaze flickered to the store clerk standing nearby. "That true?" The clerk, a nervous-looking young man, hesitated before shaking his head. "He took a candy bar. I told him to just put it back, but then these guys came in and—" Jason turned back to the ex-officer. "You're really trying to use excessive force over a candy bar?" The crowd murmured, their interest in the situation growing. The ex-officer's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, another voice rang out. "Someone mind telling me what the hell is going on here?" The commanding officer had arrived. He pushed through the bystanders, his sharp gaze landing on the scene before him. When his eyes locked onto the ex-officer kneeling on the suspect, his expression darkened. "You again?" The ex-officer quickly stood, straightening himself as if that would somehow make him look innocent. "Sir, this man—" "I don't want to hear it," the commanding officer snapped. He turned to the younger officer. "Is this man a suspect?" The officer hesitated. He took a candy bar. The clerk didn't even want to press charges." The commanding officer let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. "So, let me get this straight. You, a man who is no longer a police officer, decided to take it upon yourself to violently subdue someone over a candy bar?" The ex-officer's mouth opened, then closed. He had no defense. The commanding officer turned to the suspect, who was still on the ground. "Get up," he said, his voice calmer now. The man hesitated before slowly rising to his feet, rubbing his sore wrists. "You hurt?" The man shook his head. "Just shaken up." "Good," the commanding officer said before turning back to the ex-officer. "And you? You just couldn't help yourself, could you? You got stripped of your badge this morning, and instead of going home, you found another way to throw your weight around." The ex-officer gritted his teeth, but he said nothing. The commander sighed. "You're done. And I mean really done. You're going to be facing real charges now." The ex-officer's face paled slightly. "Sir, save it," the commander said. "Turn around." For the first time, true panic flickered in the ex-officer's eyes. He hesitated, but when the commander's hand dropped to his belt, he knew he had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned. The younger officer stepped forward and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. A moment later, the ex-officer's wrists were bound behind his back. The crowd murmured in surprise as they watched a former cop being taken away in cuffs. Jason stood silently, watching as the reality of the situation settled in for the man who had spent the morning trying to abuse his power. The ex-officer cast one last glare in Jason's direction, his expression filled with resentment. Jason simply met his gaze, unbothered. The commander exhaled. "All right, folks, show's over," he said, addressing the crowd. "Go on with your day." Slowly, the bystanders dispersed, though many of them were whispering about what had just happened. Jason took a step closer to the commander. "Guess it finally caught up to him." The older man shook his head. "It always does." Jason nodded. "Appreciate you handling this?" The commander gave a half smirk. "I think you handled most of it." Jason let out a short chuckle before glancing at the younger officer. "What about him?" The commander turned, studying the young cop who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "I'll handle it," the commander said finally, "but I don't think he's like his partner, just caught in a bad situation." Jason gave a small nod. "Hope so." The commander looked at Jason, expression serious. "You got a habit of being in the right place at the right time?" Jason smirked. "Something like that." The commander chuckled dryly. "Well, try not to get involved in any more incidents today." Jason glanced down at his blazer, which was still stained from the first altercation. No promises. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the aftermath behind him. The day had taken a strange turn, but at least justice had been served. For now. Jason Statham walked away from the scene, his steps measured, his mind still replaying the events of the morning. He had come to the park for some peace, to enjoy a quiet moment with his newspaper and coffee, but instead he had been dragged into a confrontation with corrupt officers. Now, one of them was in handcuffs, stripped of his authority and facing real consequences for his actions. Justice had been served, but Jason knew that for every one of these incidents that ended the right way, there were countless others that didn't. The thought weighed on him as he continued down the street, weaving through the light morning crowd. He had almost put the entire ordeal behind him when he heard someone calling his name. "Mr. Statham!" Jason slowed his pace but didn't turn immediately. He wasn't in the mood for another conversation, but the voice didn't belong to a cop. It was the young store clerk from earlier, the one who had hesitated before revealing the truth about the shoplifting incident. Jason finally turned, watching as the nervous young man jogged up to him. "Hey," Jason said, his voice neutral. The clerk stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath. "I just wanted to say thanks for stepping in back there." Jason nodded, his expression unreadable. Did what anyone should do. The clerk gave a small, almost embarrassed chuckle. Not everyone would have, especially not against a cop or, well, someone who used to be one. Jason studied the young man, noting the hesitation in his voice. "That guy been in here before?" The clerk swallowed, his eyes darting away. "A couple times. Never did anything too crazy, but he always acted like he owned the place. Made people nervous." Jason exhaled through his nose. He wasn't surprised. "And no one reported it?" The clerk hesitated before shaking his head. Didn't seem like it would make a difference. Jason looked at him for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "It does now." The young man smiled slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Yeah, guess it does." Jason adjusted his blazer, still carrying the faint scent of coffee. "Take care of yourself." "You too, Mr. Statham," the clerk said before turning back toward the store. Jason watched him go, then finally resumed his walk. The weight in his chest lifted slightly, but only just. He had seen too much of the world to believe that a single victory meant the fight was over. There would always be more men like those officers abusing their power, looking for easy targets. But as long as people stood up to them, as long as justice wasn't just an idea but an action, then the balance could shift, even if only a little at a time. By the time Jason reached the next intersection, the sun had fully risen, warming the city streets. He rolled his shoulders, inhaled deeply, and exhaled slowly. The day wasn't what he had expected, but it had ended the way it needed to, and that was enough for now. Justice was served, but the fight against abuse of power is never truly over. What happened today was just one battle in a much bigger war. How many others have faced the same injustice without someone to step in? What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that needs to be told.